No one knows who the first Romans were. We are told by tradition that Romulus founded the city, but his existence remains an open historical question, and even if the legends are based on a real figure, there were already settlements on some of the 7 hills that would become Rome, which far predate the mythical founding narrative. In our hunt for the first Romans, we are left with more questions than answers, not just about the historical facts, but about the very nature of what it was that actually made someone a Roman. Was it enough to reside in the geographical area associated with Rome, or was something more required? Was Rome a culture, a place, or some synthesis of the two? Echoes of this ambiguity surrounding the beginnings of Rome are seen again over 1,200 years later with the slow collapse of the Western Roman Empire. As imperial authority atrophied and Roman lands were carved up by warlords, it becomes difficult to put a definitive date on the end of the empire, and there is an increasing tendency in scholarship to argue the position that Rome never really fell. But regardless of where one falls on this debate, it's clear that just as Rome was not built in a day, it also didn't end at one decisive moment. For though centralized power gradually ebbed away, Roman culture, institutions, law, and religion continued to form the backbone of the successor states that emerged from the disorder. Nowhere is the persistence of Rome more evident than in the life of the philosopher and statesman Antius Manlius Severinus Boethius, known to us today simply as Boethius. He was born around 480, shortly after Romulus Augustulus was deposed as the last Western Roman emperor in 476, a date that many reference as the formal end of the Western Empire. But though Boethius was never really a citizen of this great empire, he was most certainly a Roman. As the descendant of a storied line that dated back to the 4th century BCE, Boethius was active in government, serving as a consul and senior magistrate, and in so doing, carrying on his family legacy and personifying the deep sense of continuity between the Western Roman Empire and the states that emerged in its wake. But though he was a capable and just administrator, and likely precisely because he was just and capable, the principled Boethius became a target for the political machinations of the Ostrogothic court of King Theodoric. The specifics of his downfall are unknown to us, but they hinge on a charge of conspiracy that he and other senior Romans were working under the cover of theological discussions between the churches of Rome and Constantinople to reunite the East and West under the leadership of the Eastern Emperor. Boethius professed his innocence, but he was quickly condemned to death in a show trial. Was this a manifestation of Ostrogothic court politics working to eliminate the influence of old Roman nobles, or a legitimate reaction to a breach in faith by Boethius and his faction? We will likely never know, but Theodoric's record of bloody purges directed at his opponents lends credence to the idea that this may have been a trumped-up charge. But if Theodoric's goal was to silence Boethius, then few men in history have failed so spectacularly. For while in prison awaiting execution, Boethius began work on one of the most important works of literature in human history. The deprivations of his imprisonment and the severe anguish of a man who had lost everything led to the focusing of his mind, as well as his considerable philosophical and poetic talents, to produce the Consolations of Philosophy, a brilliant text that seeks to answer some of the most profound questions inherent to the human condition. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. Written entirely from prison, the Consolations of Philosophy takes the form of a Socratic-style dialogue between Boethius and Lady Philosophy, a character who represents the personification of philosophical wisdom. She helps Boethius understand that true happiness doesn't come from fleeting external factors like wealth or fortune. Instead, contentment lies in the pursuit of wisdom and understanding the true nature of the good. Meditating on these core philosophical precepts at the lowest point in his life helps Boethius come to terms with his misfortune and face his looming death with dignity. These are timeless insights, and I recommend reading the book, as it is both short and accessible. It can sometimes be hard to understand the context of ancient philosophy, but our entry point here is the perspective of a man facing his inevitable death, something we all must confront at some point. The Consolation of Philosophy is also fascinating because it represents the culmination of the synthesis of Christian theology with Greek philosophy. This project of wedding the Christian religion to Greek wisdom took place over centuries, and Boethius was writing at a time when these two schools of thought had been so thoroughly unified by men like St. Augustine that they were each viewed as enhancing the other. As such, the book is very light on overt Christian messaging, though the thought patterns of the early church are readily apparent. It can be categorized as a philosophical work by a Christian, as opposed to a Christian philosophical text. The fact that Neoplatonism seems to loom larger over the Consolations of Philosophy than the Church Fathers has led some scholars to suggest that Boethius was secretly pagan, but I believe this is unfounded and fails to take into account that Christian thought in a Christian society would not feel the need to constantly refer to itself as explicitly Christian. At this point, the faith was simply assumed, particularly among the educated classes. Christianity was not an external thing that individuals believed in, which was outside of themselves, but an animating force underpinning all of society and even reality. Furthermore, not only does the Consolations of Philosophy seem to be modeled after the Book of Job, but its central focus is addressing why bad things happen in a world that is governed by a benevolent, all-powerful deity. The Greek term for this is theodicy, and the question of evil was of less concern to polytheist thinkers, as their gods were not all loving or omnipotent, and misfortune could be attributed to a wide range of deities, such as those that the worshipper had not adequately placated. Theodicy really only becomes a problem in the monotheistic context, where God is defined as all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful. Boethius handles the question remarkably well in my view, and if you approach him from a Christian background, then his reasoning is essentially ironclad. This incredible accomplishment made Boethius required reading in medieval universities, and provided a Christian framework for centuries of philosophical inquiry and debate, laying the groundwork for Scholasticism. Influential thinkers like Aquinas and Anselm built upon Boethius' ideas, creating a rich philosophical tradition that shaped Christian theology and Western thought for centuries, and has influenced life down to the present. I would love to expand upon his reasoning and the finer philosophical points at a later date. Let me know in the comments if you would like to see more on ancient philosophy, the material conditions that produced it, and the consequences of its real-world application in later videos. The claim can be made that as the bridge between the Greco-Roman traditions and the rise of Christian philosophy, that Boethius was the last of the Romans, or at least the greatest figure in the final generation of true Romans. After all, at the time of his death in 525, there does not seem to be much in the West that was recognizably Roman, at least not in the way we today conceive of Romanness. But though it can be reasonably asserted that Boethius was the last Roman, making this case requires buying into the idea that Rome actually ended in a definitive sense. As mentioned above, there was remarkable continuity of Roman institutions and culture after 476, and our search for a clean break is a result of our modern need to categorize the past into easily definable eras, and this approach doesn't accurately account for the actual experiences or opinions of those who lived through this tumultuous era. Rome was constantly evolving, constantly changing. It was never static. For even in 42 BCE, the death of Rome was being mourned as the empire took shape and the Republic lost its champions one by one. Brutus called his fellow conspirator Cassius the last of the Romans after his death at the Battle of Philippi, but we all know that Rome would persist for another 500 years. So while Cassius most assuredly wasn't the last Roman, he was among the last citizens of a Rome. For Boethius, it was much the same. He was among the last of the old senatorial aristocracy and ancient bloodlines, but many more would proudly call themselves Roman after his death. They just meant something else by it. We want to imagine the end of Rome as a cinematic apocalypse, something like the end of the world itself. Rather, it was the end of a world, for those who survived picked up the pieces and persevered, as Romans for a time, but then as something else, though the imprint of Rome would long remain on them, as it still rests with us today in ways that are nearly impossible to fully appreciate, much less articulate. So if we are looking for the last Romans, then that search will not end in our lifetime, and perhaps not even for 1,000 future generations. Rome was a place, but lives on as a citadel of ideas, some good, some damaging, but all of which must be confronted and reasoned with as we shape the modern world under the shadow, as well as the auspices, of Rome. Let us conclude then with a story of just some of those people who persevered as Romans. The Greek-American historian Peter Tyrannus recounts a fascinating story from his childhood on the island of Lemnos, which Greece captured from the Ottoman Empire in 1912 during the First Balkan War. As Greeks arrived on the island and quickly began socializing with the ethnically Greek inhabitants who had been ruled by the Ottomans for hundreds of years, Tyrannus states that the children were all curious to know what Greek soldiers looked like. So when one of the soldiers asked the children, "What are you looking at?" the children bluntly replied, "At Hellenes." When the soldier asked, "Are you not Hellenes yourself?" the children answered, "No, we are Romans." Amazingly, the people of Lemnos had clung to their identity as citizens of the Eastern Roman Empire even centuries after the Ottoman conquest. Tyrannus did not pass away until 1985, his life very nearly intersecting with my own. I find it fascinating to imagine the possibility that my time on Earth overlapped, if only for just a moment, with someone who truly and authentically felt they were an actual Roman, an heir to a tradition dating back to Romulus, Aeneas, and maybe even beyond. If you're a little older than me, you may have even passed one of these Roman children grown into old age on the street somewhere. But even if this last generation is gone, their children and grandchildren are still here, so we are not that far removed from Rome itself. I find it fitting that the last citizens of the pagan, Italian, Latin-speaking Rome of Romulus, founded in 753 BCE, would be Christian Greeks thousands of years later. It shows that anyone can be Roman, and in our modern age, when Rome's influence is still so acutely felt, nearly everyone is.